Hello and welcome to the Wyfutbol podcast for another instalment of The Chat with me, Michael Dryden and Etches Adokru. Today we're discussing COVID-19, its impact on football and whether ethically football should continue. Before we start, very quickly, please follow us on Twitter at Wyfutbol_ and subscribe with us on all our platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast and YouTube. Etches, firstly, how are you? And secondly, we've seen a big spike in numbers since Christmas. What was your initial take on COVID and football?
Well, in general, I'm pretty good. Arsenal dispatched Newcastle. We sent them packing up back to the north yesterday. Emil Smith Rowe, Bukayo Saka, the greatest players in the league. So that was really, really good. In terms of the recent spike in COVID numbers, hence why we did this episode, I think it's not good. We had the Villa team that went out against Liverpool the other day, where they fielded a bunch of under 23s, and there were rumors that it wasn't actually their best under 23s team because some of them were on loan. Then we've had the rescheduling in the league where Fulham had to play Tottenham due to really short notice because of other games being cancelled. We had Leeds and Southampton, I think, was also cancelled, although I think that might be linked to the FA Cup replay. But, that is concerning. Fulham and Villa have been hit quite hard in recent weeks. And the rise in, I think in the first lockdown, we saw football seem to be a little bit immune from COVID, where these guys are getting tested all the time, and there weren't many positive cases, but now we're seeing whole clubs having to close. There's been huge outbreaks, and lots in question as to whether football is actually safe or not. So I kind of wanted to talk to you about what protocols are actually in place.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kick this off with some background information before we go into discussion. So the protocols currently in football, testing the Premier League since December 28th has been on a twice weekly basis for all players and club staff. In the EFL, it's come a little bit later. So we have twice weekly testing for all 72 clubs from the 11th of this month, January. This has come with, like a lot of things in COVID, hasn't come without its controversy. There was initial calls for the Premier League to fund the £5 million required to fund the weekly or twice weekly testing in the EFL until the end of the season. This has now been fully funded by the PFA, the Professional Footballers Association. There's been talk of a circuit breaker at times in the EFL because, especially prior to this weekly testing, there's an idea that COVID could ravage through the league. They haven't got the funds in place to perhaps protect. Clubs haven't got the funds in place, like the Premier League, to perhaps protect themselves to the same extent. And as of today, positive cases have dropped to 32, down from 123 in the EFL, with just over 4,500 players and staff tested. So it looks as if on the EFL front and with the Premier League that we're coming out of a stage where over Christmas we've had that spike in terms of numbers, which we've seen in society generally, which is still very high. But we don't seem to have had the same in football following that spike. In the Premier League, we've had 16 positive tests in the latest round of testing. And it has been as high as 36. And we'll come on to touch about the ethics of this, but testing in non-league has been non-existent. So yeah, that's a lot for me to cover. Just bring you back in, but yeah, it's crazy with the non-league element.
Yeah, I think COVID in football is one of those interesting ones as well because players get tested positive or negative. We've also gone through the international football, which happened before, where we were opting to send players around the world when cases were rising, in particular here, to then come back. And then because you're mixing countries, they have different protocols, and that's been quite problematic. I think one of the most things which hasn't really spoken about football with the COVID itself is the recovery. So, we mentioned Premier League in particular. We'll hone in on them. We had 16 positive tests in the latest round of testing a few days ago. It's been high as 36 before. And, the Premier League are now saying, these strict new rules to stop close quarter celebrations, which just doesn't really work and doesn't make any sense. because players aren't going to do that. And also, what about corners? There's a
Yeah,
picture
yeah.
yesterday where Arsenal flooded the box for a corner kick, and they're not socially distanced. It's just silly to try and implement in the game. And I think one of the biggest topic points from COVID in football isn't really about the recovery or the testing. It's actually those who get it and how they're affected. So we've spoken about previously, actually, Timo Werner, Kai Havertz as well, and Hwang Hee-chan, who isn't in the Premier League, but have all suffered from long COVID,
Yeah,
where we've read online and people that have unfortunately gone through it struggle with this illness for much longer than the so-called 8 to 10 days it takes a normal person. And there's ethics around that in terms of how can you provide players with the best support when you don't even know how to fix them, which is what Lampard said. Lampard came out and said, how do we help Havertz? We don't know what COVID properly is. We don't know how to
yeah,
cure it.
yeah.
So now that he has long COVID and he's not feeling great, what do we do to make him feel better? And that's been a big, big challenge for clubs as well.
Yeah, I think we've almost came full circle from at the very start of coronavirus and this massive, massive campaign or almost national priority to get football back on our screens through Project Restart. We then almost came full circle now to obviously we've had the big spikes in society and now people are starting to question whether or not football should actually continue during this period from people within the game who are just looking to protect their players and their staff. Then even people in wider society, we saw the SNP talk about or condemn Celtic in the last week due to their exploits and going to Dubai and the messaging that sends out to the rest of the Scottish public. And then, but then now we're talking about, and what's been to the fore has been how should players react on the pitch to this? How should they behave in terms of things like spitting, in terms of socially distancing? I'm of the view that if they're allowed to go forward, I don't think it's fair to then try to enforce stringent rules on how they behave on the pitch because you can you can prevent. I get the whole thing around, you know, a lot of players in the Premier League coming together or within one team to celebrate a goal, for example, sends the wrong message, and that's the main point. But it is obviously a fact that they're all tested prior to the game. They've all got negative testing. Of course, somehow COVID could find its way in, but these players, in theory, are in a safe environment. And I do think it's been blown out of proportion a little bit. This idea that we should condemn these players for, relieving spit or for celebrating with one another. And the former point as well. I mean, these these are actually these elite players playing elite football. They need to clear their throats. They need to be able to breathe heavily, and because they're covering large
I think
distances on the pitch.
I think the problem is that ultimately the way it is in this country is sports have been blamed for quite a lot during COVID. We had the issues before where Matt Hancock was calling for the Premier League to do more during
Yeah,
COVID. We've had the situation now where government or papers or media uh, focusing their attention towards football again. It's not really up to football to do anything, to be honest, because the problem is that generally, aside from the game itself, cases are spiraling out of control away from the game. So, in an actual, under a microscope, football itself doesn't actually have that many cases compared to the general public. The issue is
yeah,
more around why are we focusing our attention on Premier League footballers when there are bigger questions to answer in society. And I think, yeah, okay, if we go and say stop spitting to spread COVID, how many players, what was the analysis of players actually spreading COVID to one another? As far as I'm
yeah,
aware, it's players are getting COVID either from contacts from people outside, as in maybe family members, or there is outbreaks at clubs, but we don't actually know where it's originating from. I doubt it's originating because David Luiz has hugged Aubameyang at a corner, and then they both got COVID. So I
yeah,
think I
yeah,
think I think the focus in itself is wrong.
yeah. And there's a clear demand to have the football on our screens, and I think with that demand, we have to have some kind of recognition that there's going to be almost floating the rules. And you're right in saying that footballers are privileged in society generally and in this period. But again, that demand is so high to have them on our screens, to have the clubs back on the screens. There's a lot of talk about how football's been positive for people to have some sense of normality. Comes back to this almost like routine idea that it allows people to feel like we're actually more in a normal state than we are because we're not in a normal state at all. Um, but it's a really interesting debate, and the Celtic fiasco of late really kind of builds on this idea that we're going to touch on more of the ethics around whether football should continue or how they should behave. Because in that instance, Celtic had a planned summer training camp in Dubai that they then went on. There was a positive test. It forced the squad to be delayed coming back in terms of isolating. The Celtic then had to play a game in the SPL where they had no first team players, much like Villa had to do in the Cup against Liverpool. There's calls from the SNP and people in the press to say, well, Celtic should not have done that because it sends out the wrong message. Like they are they aren't flaunting the rules, but
Yeah,
they're
but they're
flaunting opinion to an extent.
yeah, they are. I think it's ethics, isn't it? I mean, footballers, I would need to speak to people like Celtic to understand why they needed to go on the trip for whatever reason. But in the current climate, it wasn't the best move. I think another interesting point as well is the weakened teams issue that we've had in specifically with Villa versus Liverpool, and obviously Celtic versus Hibernian. I think the SPL is a bit different because that is a one instance. But I think the Premier League is
Yeah,
very interesting how the FA Cup have said, or the sponsors there, that they can't reschedule games, hence why Villa had to play a week inside. But I just think integrity needs to come into the competition actually, because Premier League games are getting postponed left, right, and centre, and I'm unsure. I know that COVID have this big thing. Sorry, not COVID. Football, FIFA, and UEFA
yeah,
have this big thing where they want all football to end by I think it's the 31st of May, because they're very keen to get the Euros going. So I'm confused as to why the increase in Premier League games is fine to adjust, but FA Cup games don't have the same type of ruling. I just don't get it. Villa can play an FA Cup with an academy team. Premier League game gets postponed. To me, it doesn't make any sense.
no, it doesn't make much sense at all. And we encountered those questions with domestic competitions. People were saying that domestic cups, are they necessary this year? And then it always like kind of unearths these wider footballing questions that have came out in terms of, well, yeah, no, the League Cup and the FA Cup. I mean, is football a priority anyway? We should bring that up. But the FA Cup and the League Cup, are they a priority? Can we just curtail them for this season until we get society back to normal? But then obviously you have then the EFL clubs then say, well, we've already lost a significant revenue stream in terms of fans performing. And they do have things like the iFollow streams where they generate some revenue, but the FA Cup is a big revenue factor for teams in the EFL, and even those teams in non-league. We saw Marine get all the way to the third round of the FA Cup and had a brilliant game against Spurs that we all enjoyed. I find it incredible that we've got non-league footballers who are part-time largely, especially in the Vanarama North, Vanarama South, many of which work in schools, might work wherever, and they are performing tight schedules, these are big leagues, and then going to work and there's no testing.
Yeah, I think it's a trickle down thing, isn't it? Where the objectives of all the clubs is to be as successful as possible. I think the problem that Premier League clubs are having, judging by the summer we just had, is they want to remain as competitive as possible, and therefore there's so much uncertainty. I can see, it's like Arsenal. They sacked the Gunnosaurus Rex. Tottenham applied
Yeah,
for a grant, then had to return it initially because there was uproar. There's been issues at other clubs as well because, pay cuts, etc. And people are saying, "Oh, how can you have so much money but you're implementing all of these cuts?" It's because there's so
yeah,
much uncertainty. These clubs are all ambitious, especially some of the top prem sides that want to do really really well. So they've ring fenced loads of cash to potentially buy transfers. I mean, we're talking in a COVID year where Arsenal pick up the most revenue from stadium attendances, yet can buy Thomas Partey in one go. We're seeing Timo Werner. Chelsea went and spent 200 plus million pounds, still knowing that they wouldn't have fans until at least
yeah,
October, and it's gone way past that now. And then today I'm reading that they're linked with Erling Haaland. And I think the problem that the smaller clubs have further down the scale is the Premier League has always been seen as greedy, and now they're going to get even greedier and tighter and stricter and more stringent because they don't know when fans are back and when their revenue streams will return. And I think the problem with that is a lot of these smaller clubs, even league clubs further down, will then really really struggle. And you're mentioning, forget about the clubs in terms of player welfare down in the Vanarama, where, as you said, a lot of their part-time jobs away from football may have dried up because of COVID, and then the other side of it, they're not getting at all because of COVID,
yeah.
which is really really tricky.
No, you're bang on. And on the Chelsea point, Premier League clubs operate within a very competitive environment, as do the players. And so Chelsea might argue, well, if I don't spend this money and we lose our competitiveness within the Premier League, then it's just going to end up with Chelsea suffering, we're going to fall out, say, of the Champions League or whatever, and then that's going to affect them. It's such a competitive Premier League that it doesn't surprise me that teams like Chelsea want to spend that money.
Yeah, no, I think you're bang on. It doesn't really matter whether it's a COVID year or not. These teams are so hungry for success, so hungry to achieve, and so hungry to get to certain league positions just to keep afloat. You know, Derby as well have suffered recently in terms of not being able to pay their wages in December, which shows you
Yeah,
how grave it is. And I think we've discussed on other pods where I think the future will see more and more clubs suffer, but that doesn't mean that the bigger clubs become more generous. They'll become even more stringent because they're thinking for themselves, okay, what do we need to stay afloat? And more importantly, what do we need in order to grow? Because this won't be a season where clubs think, oh, we'll take a rest and decide to keep what we have. Every team is pushing on and on because the other 19 teams or the league below and the league below that are trying to push to do the same. I think the lower league sides is more about keeping afloat and trying to survive, which is sad for English football because
yeah,
that's not what you want to see. I kind of wanted to ask the question, which is, should football still be played ethically? Because I think the really quick answer is yes, because virtually every other sport in the world is being played now. And when it was taken away from us for 3 months, it wasn't really fun. But it's also clear that cases are rising, in particular here. We're having issues in terms of players now catching it as well, and the rescheduling process with the potential Euros coming up in the summer, and an
yeah,
Olympic
yeah.
and an Olympic Games as well, which will have football. It kind of seems as if something has to give.
That's a major point that we haven't really expanded on. We've just mentioned there in terms of the Euros. There was talk of, well, there was discussion points around the international fixtures with England playing friendlies, for example, and then teams coming over into London to play at Wembley. But in terms of the Euros, it'd be interesting to see if that goes ahead, and the same with the Tokyo Olympics, because obviously cross-border channel transport is how this virus has spread across the world and how it continues to spread, and the different strains continue to spread. And it'd be really fascinating, I think, to see if that goes ahead. And a lot of the money that's involved with the Euros different to the international friendlies, different to the Nations League, arguably. The money that's involved in the Euros is still significant, not on World Cup levels. So it'd be interesting to see what UEFA and FIFA's stance, and particularly UEFA, their stance is on that competition with sponsorships tied up, deals that have been put together. These host nations were meant to host this; they will expect certain revenues. I think it's such a fascinating argument.
They've done loads of stuff with that, though. They've basically they've put the contingency plans in place, which basically means that they can change it. They might change to one city now. It's meant to be the
Yeah,
multi-city tournament. There's also been uproar with ticketing because there's some sort of clause put in now where if the game is moved to this type of game, I think if it's moved to like an emergency type of game, it means that you can't be refunded if it moves to another country. So
yeah,
fans are now getting
okay,
cheated out of money. Well, it works in terms of ethically for people to livelihoods, but not if you have a ticket to watch England versus I don't know Croatia in Wembley, and then suddenly 24 hours before they tell you it's in Croatia and you can't be refunded
yeah,
because
yeah,
so. That's basically what they're saying, because obviously these sponsorships don't want to lose money that they've already lost. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. I think in terms of whether it should be kept, people always argue it keeps morale high. We're in winter now as opposed to summer, and again, football is an escape for a lot of people, whether it's reporters, people just watching it, and just general fans of the game. And there are many people around the world that idolize these players that are playing, and it also allows players to do what they enjoy. I guess to a degree in terms of TV money, which doesn't actually trickle all the way down, but to a small degree it does. It helps keep clubs afloat with some form of revenue, which is positive. But then,
yeah,
we see the constant rescheduling of games, strains on footballers' personal lives, and we've seen rumors and we've seen evidence of both lockdowns where players have left their bubbles or areas to do things they shouldn't have been doing. Jack Grealish is an example. Kyle Walker is another example.
yeah,
Callum Hudson-Odoi is another example.
yeah,
There's probably loads I've forgotten about, and that's something which you then think it's taking a toll on the players as well. A lot of these players have high risk parents, so an outbreak. Anna Troy Deeney was vocal about it, but an outbreak at
yeah,
Villa,
yeah,
if there's an outbreak at Villa and you're Troy Deeney and you happen to be at Villa Football Club, that's detrimental to you because you could have. I think his son was high risk, which brings that issue back home, and it's trying
Yeah.
to ensure the safety of these players as well, just as much as the entertainment.
Yeah, we shouldn't we shouldn't forget that these players are human beings, and we've touched on it in many podcast episodes before. How these players are almost not seen as human beings; they're seen as commodities. They're on our screens; they're almost not seen like real people. I think in terms of the Premier League, I think we can continue as long as that the Premier League can continue in isolation without the rest of the leagues, which was an issue at the start. Then I think we can continue. I think Project Restart, on the whole, if you look at it, if you take away the people that have violated, as you said, like Callum Hudson-Odoi, on the whole, the restart has been a success. I mean, the
It
number of positive
has.
tests across
It
the
has.
board. I mean, we're going on nearly a year now. I don't know the stat for the yearly the yearly testing figures, but it has been a resounding success. In the EFL, seemingly, we've had a number of players tested in the last week. We have 32 out of 4,500. Obviously, again, the level of safety there and PPE and all that sort of stuff, procedure is going to be lesser at clubs that can't afford to perhaps, to heighten that. So perhaps the EFL, if it can be funded, can continue, but the Premier League can afford it. It has been safe. I don't see any reason why it can't go ahead. The EFL is more of a funding thing in terms of can they get that weekly tested funding. If they can't, I'd question again whether it should go ahead, because I think I'm pretty sure anyway, prior to the twice weekly testing being brought in this month, mandatory testing for EFL players was not a thing. So we had football coming back, and like it has in the non-league, where there's no mandatory testing. So obviously, if someone gets symptoms or if there's an outbreak, Sunderland had an outbreak, and we were forced to play a fixture at home to Wimbledon on short notice with about 11 or 12 players that were depleted from that squad. It's an interesting one. At non-league level, I don't see the viability of it currently.
No,
I'm shocked that it's actually still going ahead, because for the reasons I stated before, I just don't think without testing in place, you can safely organise a competition where you've got that many players in such a small space colliding with each other, coming into contact with each other, where you can't practice social distancing. I just think it's crazy.
I think it's just a case of it's the mix between the ethics and the financial side, where a lot of these clubs now, I think will be really struggling. And I think it will be the after effects. It may not happen a year after COVID or 2 or 3 years. We'll really see clubs that have really struggled during this time. I've read reports that transfers now have all these weird clauses put in place to ensure that players, if there's like cancelled matches, your loan can be cancelled or you can have a pay cut, etc.
Yeah,
Because clubs are now really, really worried about trying to recoup their money. I think you are right. It should, to answer the question, Project Restart has been a success, and the rescheduling highlights flaws in our society more than anything else, because it's not really up to the Premier League. It's a case of cases have been spiraling from the national lockdowns that we've had from government. But then obviously that trickles down into football because it's not immune to what's going on around it. And that's obviously put some issues out there. I do worry with this hard stop on the 31st of May. I think that's kind of what this rescheduling worries me about, because
yeah,
we're already 4 week games behind. We've had some postponements, and I think the postponements could increase. And it's what do you do about that? Can we keep players on board? We're in a national lockdown now. There are a lot of people, whether they like to admit it or not, who break lockdown rules, but there are hundreds and thousands that don't. Now, if the players again get caught, breaking rules they shouldn't do, it's just a slap in the face to the public who have had to sacrifice so much more to, not be able to see loved ones. And I don't know how the Premier League or how players will really respond to following such strict rules again. But then, having said that, if we cancelled football altogether, how long would you even do it for? You still have to play the games, so it's a tough one to kind of answer.
yeah. And then we'd start talking. If football in this country was completely curtailed, then we'd start getting into that conversation again about how much this costs in the Premier League, the bailouts for the EFL, the bailouts for non-league, and that it almost goes full circle. Like the business side of football takes over in that perspective, and then we end up in a situation where we're talking about bailouts, we talk about the Premier League bailing out the rest of it. But then when the football is on, as we'd like to see it, then it becomes issues of health, becomes issues of testing, and that divergence in kind of funding and wealth between the leagues really comes to the fore and highlights some of kind of the sadder elements of football. But I mean, listen, we'll wrap up now. I think it's just, but I think I'm glad we have football on our screens, and I do find the cross-border movement a little bit sketchy. And hopefully, I want to see the Euros. I love seeing England in the tournaments, but for me, it's keep the Prem and only keep the rest if we can afford to fund it, or afford to fund testing. Sorry. Without that, I just think it's crazy to go ahead.
No, I completely agree with that one.
Yep. So we will wrap up today. Cheers. Thank you for the discussion. It was very very insightful today. This is an ongoing pandemic that we're all looking to get behind us. Hopefully, with the vaccine rollouts across the world, we'll start to see some normality in the game. But thank you all for listening today.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers all.